So, because of the death of Billy Graham, I want to talk about something that has been on my mind for a while. It's about what is a crisis in this country. Because, Steven Pinker, who's a writer that I like, I think he's a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but he writes science books. And he's got this new piece about the Enlightenment. And I'm going to come back to Pinker. And the reason I want to make it clear that the reason I'm using Pinker is he's an entertaining writer, he's an intelligent man, and as far as I know in the public sphere, I don't know him privately, but as far as I know in the public sphere, he's a man of goodwill. And I think he's doing things that are wrong, and I'm going to point that out, but I think he's a person of goodwill. And, somebody that I'd love to have him on the show. If we can get him on the show, I'd love to debate him about it. But he wrote this piece in the Wall Street Journal, I guess, kind of promoting his new book about the Enlightenment. And he says, things are going great. He says, consider the U.S. just 3 decades ago. Our annual homicide rate was 8.5 per 100,000. That's 3 decades ago. 11% of us fell below the poverty line as measured by consumption, and we spewed 20 million tons of sulfur dioxide and 34.5 million tons of particulate matter into the atmosphere. That's 30 years ago. Fast forward to the most recent numbers available today, the homicide rate is 5.3, a blip up from 4.4 in 2014. 3% of us fall below the consumption poverty line, and we emit 4 million tons of sulfur dioxide and 20.6 million tons of particulate, despite generating more wealth and driving more miles. And this is, fantastic news. I mean, and going around the world, poverty is falling. Disease, those horrible plagues that almost wiped out humankind, they are falling. Hunger, all these things are all going away. All these predictions that we were going to become overpopulated, they were all overtaken by science. Now, Pinker says this is due to the Enlightenment. And one of the things that really gets me, not just about Steven Pinker, but it gets me about a lot of these atheist science writers, is they really know their science, but they don't know their history and they don't know their theology. And when they start talking, Pinker writes one of the books he wrote, he writes a whole thing about how there's no ghost in the machine. Well, the ghost in the machine is an idea. I don't have time to go into its history right now, but it's an idea that came of age after the Renaissance, as a reaction to certain kind of scientific thinking. It is not the way most people have thought about the soul forever. Plato wrote about the fact that there's no ghost. It's not like your soul can blow away after you die if there's a high wind. So in other words, he's arguing with things that most Christians, most believers don't believe, because he doesn't study theology. He studies science, and then he thinks, oh boy, this is like really good. Now I want to compare him. So he's talking about, he gives credit to the Enlightenment. But the thing is, there were many Enlightenments. There was the French Enlightenment, which was all based on rationality and reason, and it ended with the terror. It ended with people tearing each other apart in the name of reason, beheading each other in the name of reason. Then there was the British Enlightenment. And remember, the British cracked down on revolutionaries. They did not want the French Revolution to spread, and so they started jailing writers. They had a big crackdown about it, but they maintained a liberalization of policies. They moved into the future, bearing their traditions with them, and they owned the next century. They invented the steam engine. They basically guided the Industrial Revolution. It came out of England. They invented America, right? They invented the Constitution. Those guys who were based in Britain, those Anglo-Americans, invented the Constitution. It was from them, many of them, people of faith and an atmosphere of faith and a country full of faith. It was many of them that guided us into the present. Now, here it is. So things are going great. But here's another thing. This is why I say it's a crisis. Life expectancy in the U.S. fell for the second year in a row in 2016. Now, think about that for a minute. If that is not a guide to how well things are going scientifically, life expectancy in America fell 2 years in a row. Now, it may be a blip. 2 years is not, a trend, but it's an important statistic. And the life expectancy was nudged down by what? Opioid overdoses. People are killing themselves. They're killing themselves trying to stop some kind of internal pain. Now, the House Republicans are taking this up today, and good for them. But I think that, I am a deep believer in trying to solve your problems without drugs altogether. I'm not a doctor, so don't go off your meds because I said so. I'm just saying that, even when you take antidepressants, it should be in order to get off antidepressants. You should take them unless you have a strictly scientific imbalance and it's not caused by the events in your life. You should try to get off the antidepressants through therapy. And if the antidepressants help you do that, that's fine. So what I'm talking about is I'm talking about a world where things are going great and everybody is miserable. Louis C.K. did a routine about that. Everything's fantastic, everything's amazing, and everybody's miserable. And that seems to be really true in this country and throughout the West. In Europe, they're not even having children anymore. In Japan, they're not having children anymore. They're dying out. And then the elites say, well, we have to bring in more immigrants. And you think, well, why don't you just have more children? I said this to somebody the other day. He said this, we have to bring in immigrants. He was from another country, I won't say which, because it was a private conversation, but he said, we have to bring in immigrants because we're not having children. I said, well, why don't you get people to have more children? And he said, well, we've got all kinds of benefits for people with children. I thought, well, maybe that's not, giving people benefits is not what makes them have children. Maybe it's hope and a sense of themselves and a sense of a mission in life and a sense of purpose. I want to play for you Billy Graham at his peak. And I want to compare him to Pinker and some of these other guys. And again, I think Pinker is a wonderful writer and a man of goodwill, but I just think he's wrong. I think the way he thinks is wrong. I read the book Unbroken, wonderful, wonderful book. And if you just saw the movie, you shouldn't. Go read the book about Louis Zamperini. He was an Olympic distance runner. He ran in the Jesse Owens Olympic in '36. He shook Hitler's hand afterwards and all this. And he became an American soldier. And he was captured by the Japanese. And he was tortured. I mean, the scenes of torture in this book, she writes the book so well that it's not unbearable, but it's horrible. It is horrible. He was tortured beyond the ability of a normal human being to imagine. And he came back and he was, of course, broken. The fact that he lived through the things he lived through, just the time he was on the raft before he was rescued by the Japanese, and then the torture he went through afterwards, that anybody could live through this, is a testimony to his internal fortitude. But after that, he was broken. He became a drunk. He loved his wife, and one day he woke up with his hands around her throat because he thought he was strangling the guy. He had a dream that he was strangling the guy who tortured him. He was filled with rage. He was unreachable. His wife, even though he loved his wife, he was going to lose her. He was unreachable. And he walked in and he heard one of Billy Graham's early sermons. He would set up this tent, and so many people showed up that Graham, even though he was losing his voice, kept pushing on, kept going out, and he went there and he was saved. And when I say he was saved, never mind what happens to him after death, let's put that aside for a minute. He was saved in this life too, because God came into his life, and the last half of his life was just as beautiful as the first half had been, more so because he was suddenly helping other people. That anger fell away from him. He forgave the man who tortured him, which is an amazing thing to have done. I don't think I could have done that, but it transformed him. You only have to do that once. You only have to do that once, as far as I'm concerned, to get the toaster when you get to heaven. Billy Graham did this tens and tens of thousands of times. I don't know how many times, probably millions of times. Let's just play the second take, number 13, Billy Graham preaching in his heyday about the fact that the truths of the Bible are revealed not to the wise, but to the little children.
This cross, this preaching of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the scripture says, is wiser than all the men of all the ages. Wiser than all the university professors, wiser than all the intellectuals. It's foolish to the world, but God says this very foolishness is wiser than this world.
That's an old-fashioned, fire and brimstone kind of style of preaching. It's kind of gone out of fashion, but this thing brought people. I think he's in Madison Square Garden. He would fill the garden, like the Beatles. He would fill the garden, and people would find themselves coming to Christ. And he's the guy who talked to George W. Bush when W was using drugs and drinking. We don't know exactly what he was doing, but we know it was bad. He took a walk with Billy Graham, and he came and changed his life. This was a powerful, powerful guy. Now let's compare this to Pinker talking about why he doesn't believe in God and why it's not a scientific idea.
I think that using the word God or the attitude of faith toward that which you don't know is a cop-out. It's a way of slapping a label onto something rather than trying to understand it. Or, since we may not understand everything, just say there's some things we don't understand. To invent stories that sound as if they were true or could be true, to pretend that they're true just so that we can have a story, I think is unsatisfying, and it could even be immoral because it could lead you to mistaken policies, to getting in the way of your best understanding of how the world works, to doing things that lead to more harm than good. I mean,
And this is a narrative that a lot of these guys, Sam Harris to Christopher Hitchens, a guy whose prose I just love, sell. And the way it works is they compare the best of science with the worst of religion. So they compare, a cure for diseases from science, and then they compare a Christian bigot or who goes out and hurts somebody in the name of his religion. If instead they compared the atom bomb to the Christian charity, then they would have a harder argument to make. No science. There is no science for taking the rage out of Louis Zamperini's heart. And the other thing they talk about is they'll point to the brain and they'll say, here's a light that goes off when you experience God, so therefore that's where God lives. And I say, well, here's a light that goes off in your brain when you experience rain. I could touch that and make you experience rain, but you wouldn't get wet because it wouldn't be true. The question is not whether you experience God in your brain. The question is, are you experiencing something real? Now, how do you know that? How do you know that something you experience that's subjective is real? When I first met my wife, I picked her up hitchhiking. She got in my car. I knew exactly that I had found the woman of my dreams. 40 years later, we've had one argument in 40 years. I adore her to this day. Obviously, I was right, but I can only know that through lived experience. There's nothing in my brain that they can look at to know that. Over the course of 40 years, I'm sure I felt a million things about my wife, but I've never stopped loving her. So I was right when I saw her. That subjective experience related to something true. When the anger and the rage fell from Louis Zamperini's heart, when the tendency to depression fell from my heart, I was experiencing something real that nobody can do. They can give you a pill that stops you feeling your depression, but they cannot give you a pill that improves your life and suddenly gives you an understanding of who you are, why you were made, where you come from. It is a different thing. All of the arguments, the thing that gets me about the arguments of the atheists is not that they don't have the right to make them, not that they're bad people for making them. None of that is true. What gets me is their arguments are not very good. I've heard Sam Harris. Sam Harris would say, well, there are books that disagree. The Quran says you can't believe that Jesus is the Son of God. The Bible says you have to. Well, there are books on science that disagree too. And science has changed its mind and science has been wrong. That's a ridiculous thing to say. I mean, I'm just saying, it's not that Harris is a bad guy, that has nothing to do with it. I'm just saying it's not a good argument. Whereas the argument of Louis Zamperini's inner life is an argument. That actually is an argument. It's circumstantial. When you go in, people watch TV and they hear somebody say, that's just circumstantial evidence. So they think circumstantial evidence is no good. But if you go into a court of law and you serve on a jury, they will explain to you that some circumstantial evidence is dispositive, is proof. If you look out the window and there's snow and you walk away and you come back and there are footprints in the snow, somebody walked in the snow. That's circumstantial evidence. The evidence of what God does in people's life is evidence. It lasts over time. Just like my love for my wife, it lasts over time and it can be experienced. These guys, without meaning to, without being bad guys, are contributing to this crisis in America. When you tell people that they're just a bunch of chemicals and they can solve their problems by opiates, they're going to die of opiate overdoses. When you tell them that there's no purpose to their life, that nobody made them, nobody loves them, their sense of right and wrong is just a kind of random relative idea, you take away from them every single thing they have of value, everything they have of value. Their house is not valuable. Their love is not valuable. Nothing is valuable if they themselves are not there. If you tell them they have no free will, they have no soul, they have no spirit. These guys, with all the best wishes in the world, thinking that they're saving us, are really starting a crisis. And it is what makes it a crisis. I know I always come back to the media, but it's the media's fault. What makes it a crisis is that when they make these bad arguments, the media makes them famous because they are saying what the media wants you to believe, that there's no God, there's no purpose, you have to depend on the state for everything. You're going nowhere. They are wrong. And that's a crisis. Billy Graham is silenced. God is still speaking. If America stops listening, that will be the real crisis.